Hello, good evening, everyone. We're very prompt because we have many people streaming, so we always want to be respectful. So thank you so much for being here. It's just wonderful to see a mix of our longtime supporters and many new faces here in the audience. And as I said, many people joining us online. For those who are new here to the museum, welcome. I'm Lisa Krasner, the Executive Director, and it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's forum, 1774 and All That, with Mary Beth Norton. Tonight's forum is a collaboration between the Concord Museum and the Society of Colonial Wars in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. After me, you will hear from two members of the Society, and we're so grateful for the Society's partnership and their efforts in bringing Mary Beth Norton to Concord. We are lucky to have held two other virtual forums with Mary Beth Norton in recent years, and are excited to finally welcome her to the museum today in person. So thank you for being here. This is a special evening for us at the Concord Museum as well. It's the first forum we're holding to kick off the museum's 250th anniversary of the American Revolution commemorations. Starting tonight and continuing for the next 2 years, we're hosting forums that feature the nation's leading and cutting-edge voices around revolutionary discourse, emphasizing new voices and perspectives with the goal of expanding public understanding and engagement with the history and legacy of the American Revolution. I cannot imagine a better way to start the series than with Mary Beth Norton discussing her seminal work, 1774, which culminates here in Concord on April 19, 1775, and I'm pretty sure that wasn't a spoiler. So I hope you enjoy the forum. I'll now turn it over to Eric Hayes from the Society of Colonial Wars in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and I want to thank Lisa and Allison Schilling and the museum team for what turned out to be a very wonderful partnership and a truly collaborative effort. We really appreciate it, and we're delighted to be here this evening and co-sponsor this event. I have a few other thank yous, too. I want to thank my predecessor, former Governor Michael Aylward, for having the Massachusetts Society of Colonial Wars focus over the last year and a half on programs about the events leading up to the shot heard around the world. Michael was very much involved in the planning for this evening, and I want to thank him for that. A special thanks to Louis Berzabieta. It was Louis's idea to get in touch with the museum about this program and partnering with the museum. Louis worked closely with Allison and handled all the planning for the Society's piece of the program, including finding the caterer for tonight's reception. He was our virtual and true head of logistics. One of the Massachusetts Society's primary missions is education and colonial history. Under the leadership of the head of our education committee, Charlie Newhall, we have for the past several years sponsored Massachusetts Historical Society interns who are researching and writing on colonial history topics. This year, Charlie, working in a partnership with the Massachusetts Colonial Society, developed a program to work with teachers of history and social studies, and developed a program to work with them to have a program focused on working with the scholars of the Colonial Society and the digitized resources of both of our societies. The first part of that program was at the end of July. The second part is tomorrow with Professor Norton. It was Charlie's idea to contact Professor Norton to do this event, and we thank him for doing so. And so here we are. I want to thank all involved, and I'll turn it over to Charlie.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's really exciting to have this event come to fruition. And thank you to the Society of Colonial Wars for all the support the Society has been giving to education in the last few years particularly. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Mary Beth Norton. She's the Mary Dolan Alger Professor of American History at Cornell University, and she is also has been described as a force of nature. And I think you'll see that tonight. She is precise, she is exacting, and she is extremely well read, and she shares all of that with us, which is terrific. She's also been described as a transformative historian of early American history, and I think she certainly owns that. It is an amazing moniker to hold, but it is also she lives up to, and you'll see that tonight. She's originally from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and she stayed local for college at the University of Michigan, and then she came east to Harvard, where she earned her PhD and quickly won a prize, the Nevins Prize, for the best dissertation in American history. She then went on to teach for 51 years, 49 of them at Cornell University, and I understand some of her former students are in the audience. We won't make you raise your hands, but we're glad you're here. Since then, she has published quite a few books. She's published an AP U.S. History textbook, also used in college. Some of her books include Liberty's Daughters, The Revolutionary Experience of American Women, 1750 to 1800, Founding Mothers and Fathers, Gendered Power and the Forming of American Society, and my particular favorite, and the book that really brought me to Mary Beth Norton, In the Devil's Snare, a book about the Salem witchcraft trials, and really a book that changed our understanding of the Salem witchcraft trials. I have the pleasure of working with high school juniors every year, and we look at American history and look at the Salem witchcraft trials, and we're situated in Danvers, right there at the center, the epicenter. And what Mary Beth Norton's book does is decenter that. She takes us to Maine and has us rethink what the Salem witchcraft trials really was all about. And if you haven't read that book, I highly commend it to you. She also wrote books such as Separated by Their Sex, Women in the Public and Private in the Colonial American World. And I want to go back for a moment and say her PhD book was called The British Americans, the Loyalist Exiles in England, 1774, ring a bell, to 1789. So in many ways, I think she's coming full circle by coming back to 1774. And of course, her book, 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, is why we are here tonight. Those of you who found you were in an AP US History or AP European History class know that phrase, the long year. And you know a long year means that you're not just talking about the year, which is really quite stumbling for a lot of high school students. What do you mean? What do you mean the 19th century is the long 19th century? I don't know what that means. Well, I think Mary Beth Norton is going to convince you that the long year really means something when you start with the Tea Party in 1773. As Gordon Wood wrote of her book, it enriches the narrative with rich detail. And I would disagree with Gordon Wood because he also said, well, I'm going to change what he said. I say she fundamentally challenges the traditional trajectory of American history and particularly of the American Revolution with this book. So pay careful attention and hear how she does it. I give you Mary Beth Norton.
Well, my title for tonight is 1774 and All That, which is a sort of a cheeky take on a very famous history book called 1066 and All That, which is about the Norman invasion of England. So I thought, since I'm talking about a year, I would use that same kind of title. Now, so this year is the 250th anniversary, of course, of the events leading up to the American Revolution, the start of the, and this is a word that nobody's used yet, the semi-quincentennial. This is a word we all have to learn how to say. Frankly, it was a lot easier to say bicentennial in 1976. Now, I've been asked to speak during 2024 in a variety of places, including here, because my most recent book, as you know, is entitled 1774, The Long Year of Revolution. I can't claim to have planned ahead for this anniversary the way some historians are known to do. I mean, I know there are people who look at the calendar 5 or 6 years in advance and say, yes, I'll write a book that will relate to that date, but no, I didn't do that. I began the research for this book in 2009 purely because of happenstance. I was in residence at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and had completed the first draft of the book I'd been writing there, which Charlie mentioned, the Separated by Their Sex. I was on leave for a year from teaching at Cornell. Having finished versions of all the chapters, I wanted to reread the entire book manuscript together before drafting the conclusion and the introduction, all of which have to be written last, as my students in the audience know that I always said that, write the introduction and the conclusion last, because you need to know what you're introducing and what you're concluding before you write either one of them. I needed both time and distance from the book manuscript. I had been preparing for many months to think about how to introduce and how to conclude the book. I always like to give myself time between finishing a draft and actually doing the final version. So how to make good use of my remaining time at the Huntington? I knew that the library had pamphlets and manuscripts relevant to my next research topic, which became the book 1774. So I decided to take advantage of being there to explore some of those sources. Later on, I went back for another month, but that was another story. So how you might ask, did I know in 2009 that my next project would be a narrative history of the events of the year 1774? Therein lies the tale I'm starting with today, because it goes back to the very beginning of my career as a historian, in fact, to my graduate study at Harvard in the mid to late 1960s, which Charlie alluded to in the introduction. At the suggestion of my mentor, Bernard Bailyn, I decided to focus my dissertation on the Loyalists of the Revolution. I then chose to study the Loyalist exiles who moved to Great Britain during the war. That required me to live in London for an extended period, which I admit was my plan all along, since I'd fallen in love with London on my first visit, and I have been honest with my graduate students since that one of the reasons that I chose my dissertation topic was that it meant that I had to live in London. So while doing research on the Loyalists, I realized for the first time how important the events of 1774 were for dividing the American populace. Studies of Loyalists and revolutionaries have often identified those divisions as starting with the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 or even earlier. But reading about the Americans who identified as Loyalists and went into exile voluntarily or involuntarily convinced me that earlier political disagreements over imperial policy did not necessarily map onto later divisions between Loyalists and Patriots. That is, some leaders of resistance in the 1770s were among those who ended up remaining loyal to the crown. And some initial supporters of royal authority were alienated by Britain's responses to Americans' actions. So I concluded that in almost all the colonies, or almost all the colonists, with few, if any, exceptions, could be described as loyal Britons as late as the beginning of the year 1774. But by the end of that year, circumstances had changed dramatically. And so for my dissertation and first book, I spent hours crafting an initial sentence. As I recall, it was an entire morning that it took me to write the sentence that I'm about to read to you, because I repeat it as an epigraph in the introduction of 1774. Here it is. Quote, "The year 1774 dawned 16 days after the Boston Tea Party. And by the time its 12 months ended, the royal provincial governments were in disarray, the First Continental Congress had convened and adjourned, and the battles of Lexington and Concord were just 3.5 months in the future," end quote. It took me a whole morning to write that sentence. Now, to me, as I remember, writing in the 1960s and still today, that summary succinctly describes the significant changes that occurred during the crucial year that concerns me in this book. Yet, as it happens, historians and other scholars examining the origins of the revolution did not in the 1960s pay detailed attention to the events of 1774, and for the most part, with very few exceptions, other than my own work, they still have not done that. In my recent book, as you've just heard, I stretched the time period to include the 16 months between October 1773, when the colonists learned that ships carrying East India Company tea would be arriving on their shores, and the outbreak of fighting in April 1775. Thus, I called it the long year of revolution, and it is indeed a trope that Charlie referred to when academics refer to the long 18th century or the long 19th century and mean a few years on either side of the nominal end, starting and end dates. And I deliberately built on that with my own phrase. Now, unsurprisingly, given the insights that I'd gained from my dissertation research into what happened in 1774, when I completed my work on the Loyalist exiles, I planned to study the events of that year more closely as my second book. At the time, I was teaching at the University of Connecticut, and in those pre-internet days, I hired a graduate student assistant to start scouting research sources for me. But then, after 2 years at UConn, I moved to Cornell, and that move changed my scholarly trajectory. First, I became involved with a group of female faculty members from fields like literature, sociology, and psychology who were trying to set up a women's studies program. They introduced me to the beginnings of feminist scholarship in their disciplines. Second, a few early articles on American women's history began to appear in the journals I was reading regularly, all focused on the 19th century. The authors tended to make assumptions about women's lives in the preceding century that I thought were erroneous, even though I had never explicitly studied women. But I had read correspondence from and to women who were related to male loyalists who had been my primary interest. And I had also read and taken notes on claims from widows submitted to the Loyalist Claims Commission in Britain after the war. So I decided to write an article on American women in the late 18th century to tell everyone what was really the truth. But within a few months, it became clear it had to be a book. And it became indeed the book Liberty's Daughters that Charlie mentioned in the introduction. It was published in 1980, and it's still in print. And more importantly for this origin story, it led me to subsequent decades of work on women and gender in the 17th century, far away from my initial research plans. And ultimately, that led to the study of the Salem witch crisis of 1692, which Charlie also alluded to, which became the key predecessor for my return to my long-time interest in 1774. So that observation might seem peculiar or even outlandish. How could a book on witchcraft in 1692 affect one on the run-up to the American Revolution in 1774? The answer lies in how both books are organized. When I first proposed a book about the Salem trials, I planned a series of topical chapters. I still have a copy of my initial proposal, and it's very different from the book I ended up writing. That's because I realized, while taking notes from the legal records, that I needed a clear understanding of the chronology of the crisis, which was hard to discern from the records and from previous books, which had all been organized topically. They did not use a chronology as a part of their organizational apparatus. So I created a detailed calendar of events for 1692 on my laptop. Now, unbeknownst to me, I had a different file for every week, and I would have every date, and then I would put on every date the things that had happened on that date. Some dates had a lot of things, some dates had nothing. That was extremely interesting. But unbeknownst to me, Marilyn Roach was at the time preparing a day-to-day summary of the Salem crisis. Her book appeared in print at about the same time as mine. And our books were followed in 2010 by the definitive edition of the legal records, which did not exist when I wrote my book. The existence of either book in the late 1990s, as I was doing my research, would have made my task a great deal easier, but that was not to be. So the chronology that I created as a tool for understanding the dynamics of 1692 ended up being the crucial element in the book. In the Devil's Snare has two key characteristics that differentiate it from the books about the crisis that preceded it and from most that have followed it. First, it was largely chronological and primarily narrative in focus. Second, it presented the events of 1692 and 1693 entirely as contemporaries viewed them. I deliberately described the developments in terms used by the participants. I eschewed offering my own interpretation until the very end of the book. I kind of keep my own interpretation as a secret until the epilogue. So it's not there. I just narrate what's going on in 1692. So having successfully composed a narrative of the Salem crisis, organized chronologically, and recognizing what I had gained from doing that, when I returned to my old idea of writing about 1774, I did so aiming from the outset to create a similar narrative. I completely changed the conception of the book that I had left undeveloped for all those years, which had focused on biographies of individuals and so forth, rather than on any kind of overarching chronology. Because of my prior work on the Loyalists, I of course wanted to give them more attention than other narratives of the period did, and that meant paying attention to political moderates, not just to the radical leaders like Samuel Adams, who have traditionally been the focal point of discussions of the period. And those of you who have read my book know that this is something that differentiates mine from other works. And if you haven't read it, you will find out when you read it that it really is, you'll just get a very different narrative of the events of 1774 than you do in the few other books that deal with the period. Nobody else deals with specifically 1774, but there are books that deal roughly, at least with the pre-Declaration of Independence period. So for 1774, I adopted the same strategy I did with the Salem book. That is, I stuck with the developments at the time in North America, rather than providing a comprehensive narrative informed by subsequent historical scholarship. One of the crucial consequences of that decision is the fact that the people in, quote, my narrative only know what is going on in England when someone writes to tell them that, or when they read a newspaper account. Thus, in each chapter, there's a short section at an appropriate point entitled Advices from London, giving information about what was happening at home in Britain. For example, every other book that has discussed the destruction of the tea in Boston switches its narrative attention to Parliament and the King after describing that event. Readers of those books, like for example, Nick Bunker's excellent book, Empire on the Edge, Tim Breen's book on this period, if you read those books, you learn details about parliamentary debates, about the actions of the ministry, and the King's reactions to America in several chapters before the authors move their focus back to the colonies. I don't do that. I don't discuss debates in London in any detail then or later. Apologies, Phil, I'm sorry. I have a British former student here in the audience. Except through correspondence from Americans there, like Benjamin Franklin or Arthur Lee. Instead, I keep my eyes firmly fixed on Americans' reactions to the tea's destruction, a subject no other author has addressed to my knowledge. In the end, I therefore learned an important lesson from that first chronologically organized book I wrote, In the Devil's Snare. And I applied that lesson to 1774, the long year of revolution. Developing the same sort of chronology for the recent book reaped rewards by leading me to several revelatory findings. I now want to turn to what three of those were, and to what I gained by paying close attention to dates, which after all are what a historian is supposed to do. So let's see, I want some water here for a second. And let me just comment that in that quote I read to you that I wrote back in the 60s, I referred to the destruction of the tea as the Boston Tea Party. I no longer call it that. It is the destruction of the tea. That's how it was referred to at the time. The term Boston Tea Party was not invented until, I think it's 1836. Or 1826, I can't remember. Anyway, it's in a footnote. My now colleague at Cornell, Larry Glickman, found it out. He did a book on the history of consumer boycotts in America, and he found the first time the destruction of the tea is referred to as the Boston Tea Party. It's in a New York newspaper, as I recall. So I started by figuring out when and how Americans first learned that ships carrying tea directly from the East India Company were being dispatched to the colonies, sent to specially designated agents who would then distribute the tea to individual merchants. That news came in a personal letter sent from London in May 1773 to a Philadelphian that was initially published in a local Philadelphia newspaper in mid-August. Now let me make a couple of comments here on that sentence. The letter is written in London to Philadelphia in May 1773. It is not published in America, or an excerpt from it is not published until mid-August. So this is old news at the time Americans first learn about it. And it's an excerpt in a local newspaper, and what happens is that the newspaper editors, who all get copies of each other's papers, then reprint it. And so this excerpt was then reprinted over the next couple of months in newspapers up and down the eastern seaboard. It appeared first in a Philadelphia paper, because it was going to a Philadelphian. And that, by the way, that's why printers were often the people who ran the post offices, because the mail would come in, somebody would stand there, open a letter, say, oh, look at this news that I just got from my friend in London, and so that would be printed in the newspaper as the latest advice from London. And you can see this all the time in all these newspapers, or from someplace else, not from London, but from Paris sometimes, or Lisbon, or in fact somewhere else in the American colonies. You can see it's all, a letter to a gentleman from X, and that's because that letter has been opened in the presence of the printer, and he has said, I will print, the appropriate part of it, not the personal part, whatever that letter is, but what the news is. So this is the way news got transmitted in many ways to the colonies. So this, as I said, the extract was then printed in the newspapers, and the news it contained was incomplete and partly inaccurate, for that letter identified only Boston as a port to which tea was being sent. The East India Company, though, also had Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston targeted for tea shipments. More specific information then trickled in slowly over the next couple of months in other reprinted newsletters and newspaper reports from London. So the first colonists who penned protests against the East India Company's plans published their essays in mid-October. So here we got a letter written from May, published in August, gets a response in mid-October in New York and Philadelphia, not in Boston. We might anticipate Boston. But indeed, I discovered that Samuel Adams and the Boston Committee of Correspondence were, in retrospect, remarkably unconcerned about the news of the tea ship's impending arrival. Now that changed when opposition essays from Philadelphia were reprinted in the Boston papers. One by the young physician Benjamin Rush, who later became a leading revolutionary, seems to have had a significant impact on the Bostonians. Rush argued that East India Company tea should not be allowed to land. Other people who wrote against the tea made other arguments. They said we should force the tea agents to resign so they will not receive the tea. Some people said, no, we can let the tea land, we'll just boycott it, we won't buy it. And so there were other options, but Benjamin Rush said, no, if the tea is landed, people will buy it, so we need to prevent it from landing. Bostonians started to act against the tea in early November. So it all started in Philadelphia. It didn't start in Boston. And in fact, when the Philadelphians, I'll just say, the Philadelphians had a mass meeting where they adopted a very important comprehensive resolution against the tea. When Boston had its own meeting to talk about this, they said, the Philadelphians have a great idea, we're just going to copy it. So they didn't change it at all. They just adopted the same thing the Philadelphians already had. So again, it's not the way we usually think about the way Bostonians dealt with tea. But they did publicly demonstrate against the tea agents, but nothing could happen until the ships arrived, so a waiting game began in all 4 cities. When were the tea ships going to come? Now, knowing that the Bostonians were late to the gate in opposing the tea ships became an important part of my analysis of the eventual confrontation in Boston Harbor. But more significant was another result of my close attention to dates. Although I had lectured about the destruction of the tea for years in my course on the American Revolution, I had no idea that a ship arrived in Charleston on December 2nd, just 4 days after the first ship landed in Boston. There were 3 ships that landed in Boston, 1 ship that wrecked on Cape Cod, and 4 days after the first ship arrived in Boston, the only ship arrived in Charleston. Now, my ignorance of the coincidental timing of the ship's arrival resulted from previous historians having paid no attention to dates or even to South Carolina in their intense focus on the dramatic events further north. If other books mention Charleston at all, it was always as a brief discussion after the confrontation in Boston was considered and with no attention to when anything occurred. I had long assumed that the Charleston events followed the Boston ones, but they didn't. To me, the conjunction of dates became key to my analysis and to the organization of the first chapter of the book, for I moved the narrative back and forth between the 2 cities. The residents of neither city knew much about what was going on in the other one, although in the next few weeks, captains of vessels sailing along the coast did convey some news of meetings they had witnessed. For example, there were some reports in Boston from a ship captain who came in from South Carolina and told them that he had witnessed the events in Charleston, but that was the closest he got. But there were also copies of local newspapers that were exchanged. Now, the contrast between what happened in Boston and Charleston allowed me to show that Americans' opposition to East India Company tea varied considerably from place to place. The destruction of the tea in Boston became an example of several rather than the only iconic episode, and the differences made it possible to sharpen my analyses and focus on the key contrasts. In both ports, reactions to the tea began with mass meetings of residents, but there the similarities ended. Bostonians voted not to let the tea land and crucially recruited volunteers to maintain a 24-hour guard on the wharf to ensure it was not offloaded clandestinely. In Charleston, some men argued for preventing the tea from landing, but others supported the East India Company's right to sell it. They stood out and said, no, the East India Company should be able to sell this tea just like any other British merchant. Or they preferred convincing merchants to join a boycott once it was landed. That is, don't prevent the tea from landing, but just get merchants to all sign up and say, we won't sell this stuff. So there was a lot of disagreement in Charleston about what to do. The participants in Charleston did force the tea agents to resign, and they sought to pressure the captain to return to England with his cargo. But they didn't put a guard on the wharf, and they later on disagreed about the outcome of their meeting. Newspaper accounts of the confusion made it clear that they couldn't even reach a consensus about what exactly participants in the meeting had decided, other than trying to get the captain to return to England. It's really interesting. They completely disagree in Charleston about what they decided. And obviously nobody was taking notes. Nobody wrote it down, other than the newspaper guy who was in fact a partisan on one side and misrepresented, frankly, the findings to other cities. So they had to convene additional meetings. Those meetings were noted in the newspapers in Charleston, but unfortunately, we don't know what they said. We just know the merchants met, or the planters met, or the mechanics met, but we don't know what was said at those meetings too much. We just don't know. And so that presented a very sharp contrast to the unanimity we found in Boston. Now, a second aspect of the port's experiences, however, was the same. Both faced a deadline to resolve the issue raised by the tea's presence. Because the ships formally registered their cargoes at the customs houses, that triggered a 20-day time limit in the customs laws. Tax had to be paid on the tea within that period, or customs officers would confiscate it. That was the reason Bostonians in disguise destroyed the tea on the night of December 16th, because the next day they would have had to confront customs officers or possibly soldiers if they wanted to prevent the tea from landing. They were very nervous about the idea that the British Army, which was present in Boston, could have protected the tea and and forced it to land. And so that was why everything happened on the night of December 16th. I mean, people never talk about that, but that's why that happened that night. So in Charleston, the deadline was 4 days later, and the disagreement over what to do about the tea persisted. There was another large meeting after all those little meetings I was telling you about, and it took no direct action, but instead adopted further resolutions about a boycott. So the Charleston customs officers actually confiscated the tea for non-payment of the duty, reporting to the East India Company that they did so without the, quote, least disturbance. No problems. We just confiscated 300 chests of tea. The Carolina gentlemen, they use that phrase, had simply watched them unload the tea chests, which they then stored in the Exchange Building near Charleston Harbor. You can still see that building today if you go there. It's very interesting. And by the way, that tea was sold much later by Americans to support the war effort. But at the time, it was confiscated by the customs officers. Now, because of the difficulties that beset the Bostonians and South Carolinians after the tea ships had formally entered the harbors, the ports to which ships came later dealt very differently with vessels. Remember, they were also going to Philadelphia and New York. Significantly, Philadelphians knew about the events in Boston before its tea ship arrived. The Boston Committee had quickly dispatched Paul Revere with the news. Information from Charleston, which was incomplete and garbled, took somewhat longer to arrive, but eventually it did. It was not an important aspect of the events in Philadelphia. But Philadelphians called on the Delaware River pirates, because the ships, of course, to get to Philadelphia had to sail up the Delaware River, and so they needed the local pilots to help them. And so the people in Philadelphia published a description of the tea ship and the captain. They said he was fat, and told the pilots, whatever you do, do not help these people, do not help this ship. And so therefore, they intercepted the ship before it reached Philadelphia. And they, shall we say, persuaded the captain, but it was a really good idea to turn around and go back to England and not to bring his tea to Philadelphia. So he was obviously frightened, and he acquiesced. Now, the ship bound for New York was blown to the Caribbean by the same gale that wrecked the 4th Boston ship on the Cape, which I'll talk about in a minute, and it spent the winter in Antigua. So from Antigua, that captain wrote, he heard what had happened, he knew what was going on, and so he wrote to New York to say, guess what, guys, I'm not really going to show up. I'm going to come to New Jersey, I'm going to resupply my ship, and I will turn around and I will go back to England, no problem. So that's exactly what he did in April 1774. And there's a wonderful scene in one of the New York newspapers, I mean, I wish I could have seen it, where the New York Committee is standing in Sandy Hook, New Jersey, waving goodbye to the tea ship and saying, he's a wonderful gentleman, and he was greeted, he was greeted so warmly and so forth. I wish somebody should show that scene in a movie. Now, I found studying the shipwreck on the Cape, which other books barely mentioned, if at all. I didn't know about it until I was well into my research. I found that the aftermath especially enlightening. Now, most of the tea on that vessel was salvaged and sent to the British Army in Boston. If you want to know what happened to it, James Fichter, who is a scholar of British Empire based in Hong Kong, has given a book called Tea, simply, about tea as a political and social and economic issue in the period 73 to 76, published by Cornell Press. It's a wonderful book, in case you want to know. Anyway, he's found out what happened to that tea that went to the British Army in Boston, and I will not disclose the secret result of that, but you can read about it in his book. but some of the tea remained on the Cape after the shipwreck. Part was divided among the workers who had unloaded the cargo. That was how they got paid. It's not clear how much they ended up with, though, because most of them were then blamed for cooperating with the importers and the East India Company, and many lost their share of tea to mobs, and they were forced to go to the Truro town meeting and publicly apologize for having helped unload the tea from the ship. Now, another tea chest was split between two local elite men, the Justice of the Peace and the militia colonel, who both offered it for sale in their stores. Some Cape residents bought it, which led to vehement arguments. A town meeting formally voted that the sales were acceptable because the tea hadn't been taxed. Hey, it had been wrecked. No tax was paid, so you should be able to buy this tea. Other people said, no, it didn't matter. It was from the East India Company. You had to boycott it regardless. And another town meeting, or one town meeting said, it's okay. Another town meeting said, no, it's not, and they publicly censured the two guys, and so we had competing town meeting votes. Now, the chaos on the Cape lasted for months and included a dramatic moment when the militiamen mustered for an unsuccessful attack on their own colonel. The mobbings and arguments continued into the early summer of 1774. Which showed me what could have happened had the tea been landed elsewhere, and accordingly it revealed the wisdom of the tactic Benjamin Rush had suggested earlier, which was preventing the tea from landing, and which had ultimately been adopted by Boston and the Boston Committee. Now, Americans' understanding of the tea controversy to this day, I want to point this all out to everybody, erroneously sees Boston's action as emblematic of the colonists' response to East India Company tea. But let me pose a counterfactual question here. What would it mean if Americans today recognized that colonists' reactions to East India Company tea shipments in 1773 created widespread and long-lasting political controversies rather than unanimity? What if historians had not emphasized Bostonians' actions while ignoring or downplaying all the other actions, all the other reactions? Now, another aspect of my analysis in the book is relevant here, and it too is directly related to chronology. During the Watergate affair in the mid-1970s, which we've heard a lot about recently because of the anniversary of that too, the Congressional Committee investigating Richard Nixon famously asked a critical question about his involvement about a break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters at Watergate Complex. I'm sure everyone my age and older knows what that question was, but I'll just repeat it. What did the president know, and when did he know it? What did the president know, and when did he know it? Now, I have modified that question and applied it to the history of the tea controversy in 1773 and to the revolution as a whole. What did the colonists know, and when did they know it? The thrust of my narrative is therefore not simply reconstructing the sequence of events, but also identifying when the Americans learned of certain events and how they responded to that knowledge. And I should say here that friends who have read the book have told me that that to them is one of the most interesting aspects of the book. That is, understanding that events happened that nobody knew about for months, and that therefore the results and the reactions came months later, and that really changed their attitude and their understanding of the period. We're also familiar today with instant information, even about far-off events from our localities. It's really hard to imagine sometimes how long it took in the 18th century for accurate news to travel to America across the Atlantic or up and down the seacoast, or even into the inland. So my second example from the book has to do precisely with the delayed sharing of information, in this case across the Atlantic and not up and down the coast. Now, excuse me, the emphasis on when the colonists learned key information turned out to be important to my interpretation of the coercive acts, the laws passed by Parliament to punish Boston and Massachusetts as a whole. The first, the Boston Port Act, closed the port to traffic by tea until the tea until the tea was paid for. News of that act, adopted in January, arrived in mid-May to go into effect on June 1st. Thus, the colony had just 2 weeks to adapt, leading it to a mad scramble, and I discovered the customs officers especially had to scramble because they had to move all of their infrastructure to Salem, which was now going to be the port of entry for trade from Massachusetts, and they had to do it in 2 weeks to comply with Parliament's law. Now, the second was the Massachusetts Government Act, which altered the colony's charter in major ways. It and the third act, the Administration of Justice Act, which I'll talk about in a minute, were both proposed in mid-April and approved by the king in late May. So we have one act passed in January, going into effect immediately after mid-May when it first arrived. And then we got 2 acts passed in mid-April, approved by the king in late May, and then making their way to the colonies. Now, the contents of these acts, the later ones, were disclosed in rumors as early as late June, but official copies did not arrive in the colonies until August 6th. And the colonists were very wary of rumors. Sometimes we think that people today should be wary of rumors on the internet before spreading them. And colonists in the 18th century knew not to pay attention to rumors about what was going on in London. What you had to have was things in writing. And in this case, what you had to have was the actual acts of Parliament actually approved by the king. Now, the differences in timing, the dates when the laws were enacted, coupled with the dates when their contents became accurately known in the colonies, turned out to be the key to understanding the reactions to them. The Port Act took effect just 2 weeks after it arrived, and everyone had to respond to it quickly. The Massachusetts Government Act was implemented immediately in mid-August by Governor/General Thomas Gage, who made the charter changes that it provided, including appointing new members of the Governor's Council, which of course turned out to be a particular flashpoint. The Administration of Justice Act portended a menacing future rather than the immediate threat of the other 2. Now, I should say, what did it do? The Administration of Justice Act provided that a colonial official or a military officer who was accused of killing a colonist would be tried in England rather than in the colonies. The colonists called it the Murder Act. I was really surprised when I saw that. I'd never seen it anything other than in the documents I was reading, but I came across it repeatedly that the colonists started calling it the Murder Act. So it portended a menacing future. Now, although I found some colonists who defended the Port Act and some colonists who defended the Massachusetts Government Act, and so if there are partisans of Massachusetts here who want to know how people defended it, I'll happy to tell you that in the question period. I located no defense of the Administration of Justice Act. No colonist ever defended it, to my knowledge, even in the most conservative colony, which was Georgia, which was so conservative it didn't send representatives to the First Continental Congress. So I conclude, actually, that opposition to the Administration of Justice Act in August 1774 and thereafter was an important part of the rising sentiment for resistance to Great Britain. Now, that leads me to my third example of the importance of chronology. I arranged my notes from disparate sources chronologically. The most notable and unexpected revelation that caused, for me, involved a series of events in New England in December of 1774 that were reported in newspapers, private correspondence, and official reports. But it turned out that the story started earlier, in mid-October, in interoffice communications I found at the British National Archives at Kew. The letters I read came from the British ambassador to The Hague to a Secretary of State in London reporting that American vessels had come to Amsterdam seeking to buy arms and ammunition. I note that timing, mid to late October. Now, the Continental Congress was then winding down, but for colonial ships to have reached the Netherlands by mid-October 1774 they would have had to leave North America in August or early September. The timing was significant, suggesting that colonial merchants were starting to prepare for war even before the Congress convened. Congress convened on the 5th of September. And these ships, I realized, had to have left right about then. And in any event, they couldn't have even waited for any events or any actions of the Congress, because the Congress didn't report any actions for some weeks. So that confirmed my tentative sense that I'd gained from other things, like the lack of support for the Administration of Justice Act and other things, was that really there'd been a turning point reached in support of resistance by the end of the summer, even before the Continental Congress met, even though we put all this emphasis on the Continental Congress. Now, the ministry called the reports from The Hague to the attention of George III. On October 19th, the king issued an order in council forbidding the exportation of any arms and ammunition from Great Britain to the colonies for 6 months. Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for America, drafted an accompanying directive to governors ordering them to impound any military supplies that the colonists attempted to import. And Dartmouth instructed the ambassador in The Hague to try to interdict any arms shipments from there to the colonies. On December 8th, here's another crucial date, the news of the October 19th order in council arrived. It arrived in Rhode Island, where the General Assembly was in session. In brief, all hell broke loose. 3 attacks on forts in New England followed in quick succession. I had not linked these in my thinking until I realized that the attacks were all connected and being instigated by the arrival of the news of the King's Order in Council. The King's Order in Council was the middle of October. The news arrived in early December, on the 8th of December. Now, anticipating that the King's Order would lead Thomas Gage in Boston to send a man of war to Newport to seize cannon housed at the fort there, the Rhode Island Assembly moved swiftly on the very day the news arrived from London in their colony. Before nightfall on December 8th, the Assembly ordered local vessels and sailors to take charge of the guns. Volunteers worked steadily through that and the next night, that is through the night of the 9th of December, eventually carrying off 44 cannon to Providence. That's 8th and 9th of December. On the 10th of December, the Providence Gazette published the King's Order, and then it spread through the publication of the newspapers through the colonies, began to spread beyond New England to New York and farther south, and where there are further confrontations that I talk about in the book, and I'm not going to talk about now. On the next day, the 11th, the Rose man of war sailed into Newport Harbor from New London, Connecticut, where it had been based, and discovered that the fort had been stripped of its cannon. Was this in response to orders from Gage? I actually don't know. The timing would have been very tight, but it seems awfully coincidental that it arrived just at that moment. The Rose's captain upbraided Rhode Island's popularly elected governor for the loss. The governor replied, the captain reported that, quote, they had done it to prevent the cannon from falling into the hands of the king, and they mean to make use of them to defend themselves. And of course, Rhode Island and Connecticut both had popularly elected governors at the time. Now, with the Rose absent in Newport, the Rose left New London, went to Newport, so what happens in New London? The men moved to take over the cannon from the batteries in the harbor at New London. On December 14th, they transported most of the cannon inland and stored the ammunition in 3 widely scattered locations. But by then, on the 13th, I've skipped over the 13th, but by then, Paul Revere had already brought the news of what had happened to Newport, what happened in Newport to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Again, the Boston Committee sent out Revere as their messenger. Now, unlike Rhode Island and Connecticut, New Hampshire had a royal governor, John Wentworth. Nervous about the Newport events, he addressed the militiamen stationed at the fort at his harbor, Fort William and Mary. He warned them to be prepared for an attack. Rumors swirled, as they had in Newport, that General Gage would send troops to confiscate the arms. On the 14th, local committee members gathered 300 to 400 men and overran the fort and its 6 defenders. I mean, there's hundreds of guys. There's 6 defenders. They held them prisoner while they carried away about 100 barrels of gunpowder. Even more men gathered the next day to carry away 16 cannon and about 60 muskets. That day, the 15th, here's another scene I would love to see portrayed somewhere. A sergeant went out to parade through the streets, beat a drum on the corners, and make public calls for the militia to muster. But no one heeded the summons to arms because, of course, the militiamen were the ones who'd run over the fort. And so they were not about to muster to defend the fort. Now, finally, help arrived from General Gage at Boston, and the raids on the fort's armaments necessarily ceased. But Wentworth told Dartmouth that he couldn't arrest and punish the guilty parties because no local officers would arrest them and no local jury would convict them. Now, colonists everywhere recognized the significance of the attacks on the New England forts. They did not universally approve. Far from it. Many were concerned about the reported violence. Some feared that the attacks would stimulate imitators elsewhere. Others that they would lead to further retaliation from London. But events were moving so rapidly. Here's another conjunction of events that's interesting to think about. That by the time the authorities in London had time to react to the information about the attacks in December of 1774, war was already upon them. Guess what? The reports to Lord Dartmouth went that way, and the order from Dartmouth to Gage to move on the stores at Concord came the other way. They must have crossed somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. And so everybody here knows what happened here on the 19th of April in 1775. So we might conclude from these 3 episodes that timing was everything. It governed the events themselves in the 18th century, for when things happened had a lot to do with how and why they happened. From the nearly simultaneous incidents in Boston and Charleston, the Cape Cod shipwreck, the impact of the 20-day rule in the customs statutes, and the crucial significance of Philadelphia and New York knowing what had happened in Boston before their tea ships arrived. Delays in when the colonists learned about events in London, in particular the passage of various coercive acts and the King's October order in council, largely determined their reactions to those events. And finally, timing, of course, helped to create my own interpretations as a historian, especially because I decided from the outset to prioritize contemporary 18th century knowledge of my topics rather than subsequent interpretations by historians. I call that a proper historical ending, and with that, I'll end this talk and open it up for questions.
So thank you.
Yeah.
That was terrific. What I'd like to do is sort of field the questions, and then for the people who are at home and watching, I'm going to restate the questions. So I'm going to put on my teacher hat. Who has questions? Sir.
We're from Portsmouth.
Aha, great.
And it's our understanding that the gunpowder and ammunition that was taken from Fort William and Mary was brought down to be stored in Concord.
Entirely possible. I don't actually know that. But yes, it's entirely possible.
So the gun, your question is?
Well,
It's an observation.
it's
Yeah,
an
okay.
observation,
Good.
but it's also a comment that the amount of interaction and communication up and down the seaboard
All right.
was, and Revere obviously played a
Yeah.
role in riding up to Portsmouth to let them know what's going on. But it just underlines the support network that had been developing that allowed the colonists to work so effectively.
So I think the observation is that support network, that communication network, had grown quite dramatically in 1774 to get the news from Newport up to Portsmouth in such quick time.
Right, and actually, and I have an observation too about that, which is not about that particular support network, but rather about the fact that one of the things I learned when I was working on the book was that although there was pretty good networking, not just Paul Revere, but other messengers between Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, there was very little messaging below Philadelphia, and that the people in Boston did not have connections farther south than Philadelphia. So when the people in Boston when the people in Boston were trying to get their position on resistance adopted through other colonies and were spreading the news of the Boston Port Act specifically, when they sent to Philadelphia, they basically said, okay, Philadelphians, you're responsible for spreading it further south because we don't know those people. You have those connections, we don't. So in fact, there was a decent network in the what we call the Northeast and the Middle colonies, but even as late as May of 1774, there was very little below. And one other thing I would comment on is that they picked Philadelphia as the site for the First Continental Congress because it was centrally located, but most of the delegates had never been to Philadelphia.
Yes?
The first publication of the letter about the tea coming to America was in Philadelphia. Was Benjamin Franklin any of the publishers that picked that up and ran with it?
Benjamin Franklin was not there. Benjamin Franklin was in England at the time.
His publishing company was there.
Well, there was no, not really. I mean, he wasn't running it. I mean, there was, I don't remember the name of the first Philadelphia newspaper to publish it, but there were several Philadelphia newspapers. I don't remember the first one, but Franklin had nothing to do with it. He was long gone. He had been living in London for years.
Others, questions? Yes, sir.
Over here.
Wonderful to hear from you. Really congratulate. Who knew what when, I think should be a good stead since your class is through.
Yeah, this is my former student over here who used to ask me questions in class. That's all right.
Great answers. I'm curious, the terms that are used of this are obviously very important. So the Coercive Act, who called it the Coercive Act? Was that the British Parliament? No. Or was that the local?
Who called it the Coercive Acts?
Actually, it's historians who call it the Coercive Acts, but in fact, the locals called it the Intolerable Acts, which I actually don't use. I use Coercive Acts. But it's a good question, Phil. You always ask me good questions. What can I say? I don't know specifically who coined the term. Maybe somebody here does know. I'm looking at you, Bob Gross. Do you know?
Sir.
No.
In a lot of reading of these old documents, are they in original cursive? Are they all printed? And were they transcribed so you could read through them a little bit easier?
So one thing that Mary Beth Norton does is read documents, and a lot of them. So the question is, are the documents in cursive? What means are they in that you see today?
Are you talking about the original documents or the publication of them? The original documents.
Original documents.
Oh yes, in 18th century handwriting.
Yeah.
I had to learn how to read 18th century handwriting. Then I had to learn how to read 17th century handwriting, which is a lot harder, I have to say. But I will tell you a story about reading 18th century handwriting. When I was a graduate student beginning my research, one of the collections of papers I looked at was the John Singleton Copley papers at the Library of Congress Manuscript Division. And Copley was involved in the tea negotiations because his family had connections to the royal governor, and he was trying to negotiate a deal in the middle of December 1773, and he was sort of going back and forth between the tea captains and the customs officers and the governor and so forth, and trying to get a deal worked out. Anyway, so I was reading his correspondence at the Library of Congress, and I was just learning how to read 18th century handwriting, and there was a word in the middle of a sentence that I absolutely could not read. I could not figure out what that word was. And I tried and tried and tried, and I knew it was going to be important, and I'd want to quote this, but I couldn't figure out what the word was. So on my notes, which were then, I think, typed or handwritten, I hand wrote in my note what the word looked like, but I couldn't read it. I couldn't know what it meant. Well, when I finally went back to it, 3-4 years later, to write my dissertation, I knew immediately what the word was. It was wretched, misspelled. I had no trouble. But you have to learn. There's no other question. I mean, when I was teaching my Salem witchcraft seminar before the new records came out, I had to spend a couple of weeks teaching the undergraduates how to read 17th century handwriting before we could go anywhere, because the publication of the records in the 1970s was so inaccurate it could not be trusted for more than sort of basic research. But if you're going to quote anything, I said you had to quote it from an original document.
I think one of the things that comes out of that, though, is thinking about reading, seeing the letters that were formed in the 18th century, and thinking from their point of view about time. I mean, that's kind of one of your key points, is that the chronology matters for them at their time differently than if an historian sort of drops in from the 21st century.
Right. And I'll tell another story here, too. I omitted it in my talk, but when I actually, having circled back to my 1774 topic for the first time since I was a graduate student, I circled back to my own graduate mentor, Bernard Balin, and he actually read a draft of the first chapter for me and gave me some really nice suggestions. But in addition, I had conversations with him. If I was in Boston for one reason or another, alas, he's now dead, but we had several of these conversations, and I'll never forget a conversation with him when I commented about how the different timing of the adoption of the coercive acts had led to different reactions to them. And he didn't realize, this is one of the great scholars of the American Revolution, did not realize the differences in the timing of the adoption of the coercive acts.
Transformative.
Yeah.
Other questions? Sir?
The Murderous Act.
The Murder Act.
Yeah, that was a real eye-opener as you said that to me. And I'm wondering what echoes of the distrust that must have generated between the official higher government in England and the local governments in the United States. What echoes did that generate in our own experience in the Confederation and then the Constitution and even down to
That's a
today?
good question.
Do you want to just take?
Yeah, do you want to restate it, Charlie?
I think what you're trying, I'm not sure I can. I'm sure I lost it in there. So you want to?
I would restate it as saying,
that one.
What are the subsequent echoes of the Murder Act coming down through American history, or for that term? I actually don't know that there's any that I could point to specifically. I mean, to me, as I said, events moved so rapidly. After colonists learned about the details of the Murder Act, which is really in August of 1774, I see, as I said in my talk, a kind of a rush towards, if not independence, then significant resistance by the time that the Continental Congress is convening. And especially after the Continental Congress has adjourned, even though this is not the way people usually see it, but it comes out in many of the things I read, from local statements by county resolutions and so forth. But I use a particular story in my book it was just very meaningful to me when I found it. It's an essay in a Philadelphia newspaper published in November of 1774 after the Continental Congress has adjourned. And we don't know who the author was. We do know it wasn't Thomas Paine, because he didn't arrive in Philadelphia before then. We know exactly when he arrived, and he was not there then, so he's not the author. But I can almost quote exactly what it says. It says, it's celebrating the Continental Congress, and it says, I can see 100 years from now, the celebration of the Continental Congress. There will be bells, whistles, yada, yada, you name whatever they want to say, to support, to celebrate what's happened. And I read that and I thought, the Revolution Centennial Celebration in Philadelphia in 1876. There it was, the foreshadowing of it. It was written in 1774 in Philadelphia. It was somebody who foresaw almost independence, not quite. I mean, the implication of that, if you look at I have quite a long quote in the book about it. I was blown away by it. And what's interesting is that I discovered that some other people have used that same essay, and somehow nobody ever picked up on the significance of that particular statement in that essay.
Well, there's another Congress, the provincial Congress,
Yeah.
that happens here in Salem and then here in Concord. And that one seems to be a moment of maybe Massachusetts lurching in that direction,
Yeah.
or maybe it's moderate. Do you want to talk about the provincial Congress?
there is, also I point out, and I pointed out this to Balin in our conversation, that to me, one of the very first things that happened was when the Massachusetts Provincial Congress told local town treasurers to give money to their appointed treasurer rather than to the official colonial treasurer, and when they started to designate money to pay for the messengers who were carrying news various places. And that was a real statement of what was going on under the radar, shall we say. Yeah.
Great. We have a reception coming up in a second, but does anybody else have another final question somebody wants to ask? Ma'am, please, our hostess.
So you talked about at the beginning how 1774 you treat as this long year. So
Right.
you have some license to choose what defines your 1774. So maybe this is a plug for Concord as well, but what made you choose Lexington and Concord as the coronation event?
Okay. So
So the question is, why 1774, 1775 ending with
Right.
April 1775? Why is that the end point?
Actually, from the time I planned this book, I knew it was going to end with Gage's order to the troops to go to Concord. I knew that was going to be the ending of the book. And I really wanted to stop the book then. And my editor said, no, you have to say something else about what happened next. So I did. If you read the book, you'll see there is a kind of an epilogue which talks about how the news of the battles of Lexington and Concord goes south, and how long it takes to get to Virginia, how long it takes to South Carolina, and how distorted a lot of that news is when it first arrives. But in the beginning, I wanted to just end with the order.
Well, Mary Beth Norton has agreed to sign some books. There is a reception that's being put on by the Society of Colonial Wars and the Concord Museum. And the stars of the show are you all for being here. So thank you to you all, and thank you mostly to Mary Beth Norton. Thank you.